They buried Samuel Graves on a Wednesday. His wife wept, his children clung to one another, and the townspeople paid their respects before the gravediggers shoveled the last pile of dirt onto his coffin. By sunset, his grave was just another patch of earth in the Hollow Creek Cemetery, undisturbed, final, and absolute. But by Friday night, Samuel Graves was seen walking through town. At first, it was just a rumor. A drunk claimed to have seen him near the old church, staggering as if lost. No one believed it. Grief does strange things to the mind. But then a group of teenagers swore they saw an old man standing by the cemetery gates, watching the town with sunken, lifeless eyes. By Saturday, it wasn't just whispers. Samuel's neighbor, Mrs. Holloway, saw him on her porch. She screamed as the figure of Samuel stood there, wearing the same black suit he'd been buried in, his eyes clouded and distant. But when she blinked, he was gone. Word spread fast. The town was on edge. The police were called, but who do you report a dead man walking to? Some believed it was a ghastly prank, but others, those who had truly looked into his empty eyes, knew something was terribly wrong. Then the unthinkable happened. That evening, Samuel Graves walked into the Hollow Creek Tavern. The bar fell into dead silence. The few patrons, laughing over drinks just moments ago, turned pale as they stared at the man standing in the doorway. He looked off. His skin was pale as wax, his fingernails dirtied, and his lips cracked. The bartender, Henry Larkin, swallowed hard. Samuel? He stammered. Samuel didn't answer. He simply stared at Henry, unblinking, unmoving. His presence felt wrong, like something that didn't belong. His chest barely rose as he breathed, and his eyes were sunken and void of light. Then, without a word, he turned and walked back into the night. The bartender locked the door immediately. "That's not Samuel," he whispered to himself. "That's something else." The rumors spread like wildfire. By Sunday morning, half the town believed Samuel had risen from his grave, and the other half refused to say his name aloud. Sheriff Ellis wasn't one to believe in ghost stories. He had seen enough drunks, pranksters, and liars to know that fear could twist a simple misunderstanding into something monstrous. But even he felt the weight in the air, a sense that something had shifted. Determined to put the nonsense to rest, he marched to the cemetery with his deputy, Henry Olson, shovel in hand. The plan was simple: dig up Samuel Graves and prove to everyone that he was still resting 6 feet under. But when they reached his plot, their blood ran cold. The earth was disturbed, as if something had crawled out from below. The coffin lid, when pried open, was cracked from the inside. Inside, there was no body, only scratches on the wood and torn fabric from a suit. Henry stumbled back, face pale. "He was buried," he whispered. "We all saw him. How the hell is he not here?" The sheriff didn't answer. He had no answers, only fear. Meanwhile, Samuel's wife, Margaret, sat in the dim glow of a single lamp in her parlor. She had locked her doors, drawn her curtains, and whispered prayers she had long forgotten. She had been hearing something, a faint, rhythmic sound tapping on her window. She knew better than to look, but she did. Outside, in the dim glow of the street lamp, Samuel stood at the edge of their property, staring up at the house. His hands were raw, his nails cracked and bleeding. His lips moved, but no words came out. Then, slowly, he raised one trembling hand and knocked on the glass. Margaret stumbled back, hand clasped over her mouth. It wasn't just seeing him that terrified her, it was the expression on his face. There was no recognition, no warmth, no sorrow. Just emptiness, a hollow, soulless gaze. And then she realized something else. Samuel was mouthing the same words over and over. "Let me in." Margaret turned and ran. The next morning, she was found in the church, trembling, unable to speak. The priest covered her in a shawl and whispered blessings, but nothing could erase the look of pure terror in her eyes. She only said one thing, her voice hoarse. "That thing isn't my husband." The town knew it then. Whatever was walking their streets, knocking on doors, wasn't Samuel Graves. It was something else, something that had worn his skin and crawled out of his coffin like an animal. By nightfall, more sightings were reported. Samuel had been seen lurking behind houses, standing motionless in empty streets, staring into windows at ungodly hours. He never spoke, never moved, never blinked. Then, people started disappearing. It began with a young boy, Jesse Hawkins. He had dared his friends to sneak into the cemetery with him after dark. They found his footprints in the dirt, leading towards Samuel's grave, but there were no footprints leaving. Jesse was never seen again. A week passed. Then, an old man, Mr. Redding, went out for a late-night walk. He was found the next morning at the cemetery gate, his face frozen in an expression of pure horror. His heart had stopped, but there were no marks on his body. That's when the town took action. The sheriff gathered every able-bodied man, and under the cover of night, they stormed the cemetery with torches and guns. They didn't know if Samuel was a ghost, a demon, or something worse, but they knew one thing: he had to be stopped. They found him standing near his grave, motionless, waiting. His suit was torn, filthy, and soaked with something dark. His skin had begun to wither, but his eyes glowed faintly in the moonlight, as if something unnatural had taken root inside him. The sheriff raised his rifle. "Samuel, if you can hear me, say something." Samuel tilted his head. Then his mouth stretched into a smile, too wide, too unnatural, and he whispered, "I was never in that coffin." The air turned ice cold. Before anyone could move, the torches flickered and died. A scream pierced the night, then another. Gunshots rang out, but they hit nothing. The darkness was alive, swallowing the men whole. By the time dawn broke, only 3 men returned. Their hair had turned white overnight. They refused to speak of what they saw in that darkness. As for Samuel Graves, he was never found. But every now and then, people still see him, standing at the edge of the cemetery, waiting, watching. And if you ever hear a knock at your window in the dead of night, don't look. And whatever you do, don't let him in. If you enjoyed this terrifying tale, make sure to subscribe to Eerie Tales for more haunting stories every week. Have you ever heard of something like this happening in real life? Let us know in the comments below. And if you ever find yourself near an old cemetery late at night, remember Samuel Graves.